Twig 5. "What's wrong, Shino?" my mother asked. "No bear!" he cried, pointing to the book my mother was reading to us insistently. Having been around for the same book reading, I had no idea what he was talking about, so I was at a bit of a loss when he looked my way. "Tawa! No bear!" "Yes?" I agreed awkwardly, because there was, admittedly, no bear. Mother lifted the book and flipped a few pages back, scanning each one, until she stopped on a page with a kid-friendly bear lurking in the background with a bunch of other friendly animals, providing help or emotional support on the main character's adventure to do something or other. Okay, I won't lie, I was struggling. Since reading was my only normal hobby, my parents, especially my mother, had made a habit of reading stories to me and Shino, which, well, I appreciated the thought, but the quality of kids' books definitely varied pretty wildly. The one about the magic candy shop? Pretty good for a kid's book. The one about the magic mirror that led to a mysterious castle? Just a good story, period. The one where a kid traveled into a fantasy world as a method to cope with his parents' divorce and his mother's attempted suicide? Made me reevaluate what the fuck you're allowed to put in a children's book. Because apparently you can write anything in these books as long as the main character is a 10-year-old, and you don't draw too much attention to the fact that his mother left the oven on intentionally. But overall, not bad. To make up for the fact that he was so often away though, my dad had bought me a series of subscriptions to several short story magazines for kids, and I'll be blunt. When you buy a book of short stories, you go in with the expectations that some will be incredible and some will be forgettable. And this one, about a dog and a monkey that were looking for their cat friend that had been in the background of 3 different pages so far, had somehow copied Im's power into a written form. I couldn't have told you anything else about the story if you put a gun to my head. I had to assume Shino was in the same boat, if he was focusing on background characters more than the plot. But I wasn't sure what my mother wanted me to say about it, or why she was looking at me like that. Whatever, I thought as I touched the armrest of the chair and spread a web of chakra along its surface like invisible cracks. Taking the path of least resistance through a material was second nature to me now, and I channeled chakra down its legs into the floor as a series of tiny tubes. Scattered seemingly randomly across the floor were countless motes of metal dust, and the moment my chakra touched one, a tube extended abruptly out in another direction, too faint for the eye to see. It made contact with another, and another, and another, a zigzagging line of chakra extending across the floor and out of the room, guided by my faint senses of the traces I'd left on them previously. Over the last couple of years, I'd made a habit of keeping some of this dust around me at all times, as a means of training, self-defense, and, I'll admit it, entertainment. I'd started by keeping track of the dust with my bugs and using them to guide my chakra, before slowly weaning myself off using them as a crutch, steadily removing parts of the chain they made and relying on my ability to target the dust without them, forcing myself to get a feel for things that had already been marked by my chakra. Then, I practiced giving a basic structure to the dust using my chakra, making a scaffolding out of many different tubes, and moving the dust either by moving the tubes around the dust like a pivot, or by contracting the tubes. From there, I'd focused on making shapes and moving them using nothing but my chakra, which was a valuable exercise that just so happened to be the most entertaining toy available to me, 99% of the time. Sometimes I extended it as far away from me as I could, training how far I could maintain control of it. Other times I shaped it into different forms, swapping between them as quickly and accurately as I could. I formed them into words as I was reading a book, copying down whatever I saw, or used it to make tools as I needed them, manipulating things with it instead of my tiny baby hands, when I needed to cut cloth, hold it, or dye it. Other times I just treat it as a puzzle, trying to figure out how I'd resolve some mundane issue with the metal, like getting it up or down a flight of stairs by making a slinky, or a trail of fake bugs, or whatever else. Today, I guess I was making a bear. Calling it together took only a thought, and sadly, not just because I'd grown more skilled. After all the experiments I'd run, I had less than a kilogram of the stuff left, and restocking it was apparently proving to be a bit of a pain. I decided to cover up my disappointment by treating it like a challenge, continuing to make ends meet despite my dwindling supply. I built the image in my head like I was constructing a tiny building, using my chakra to make miniature columns, floors, and girders, leaving as much empty space as possible. Then, a layer of dust across the outside gave it a relatively smooth surface, and I guided its artificial limbs to move through careful contraction, expansion, and rearrangement, like a puppet on invisible threads. And a rough approximation of a metallic teddy bear sauntered around the corner with exaggerated, swaggering movements, stepping through the doorway. "Look, Shino," Mother said. "Mr. Bear is back." "Bear, Bear!" Shino said, hands outstretched towards it as I guided it through the room. Seemingly simple steps guided by a complicated series of chakra manipulations. The story seemingly paused, to no one's loss. I guided it through a set of swinging, almost dancing steps, like a cartoon character come to life. Sometimes I made its legs stretch unnaturally. Other times I had it nearly lose its balance and swing its arms desperately as it seemingly struggled to right itself. Shino clapped excitedly at the show, while my mother smiled and periodically touched her hand to my forehead, absently checking my temperature out of habit. My mother was kind enough that she never once said she was relieved that Shino was just a normal kid. By the standards of a ninja family where everyone had bugs inside of them, at least. But I wouldn't have blamed her if she had, because even I was relieved about that. Even with what I'd done, it had taken time for Shino to recover from being born so early. Along with a strict and careful diet and routine hospital visits, I'd repaired all the damage I'd found, but he'd been so small that even retaining body heat had been an issue for him for a while. By tacit agreement, the family technique, which was normally passed on to members of the clan shortly after birth, wasn't given to him until his second birthday, on the very edge of when it was safe to pass on, and there had been talks about not giving it to him at all. My mother had been the deciding factor on that in the end. I suspected she didn't want Shino to grow up excluded from the clan's traditions and always be the odd one out. But I hadn't asked, and she hadn't said. I'd made sure the process went as well as it could, as a bizarre birthday present. Other than that, he seemed fine. There'd been a scare around his first birthday because of a cold that just wouldn't go away until I made it go away. And we'd worried there was something wrong with his immune system. But I tweaked it as best I could, and it seemed fine for now. He caught colds more easily than most children, perhaps, but then so did I. Eating anything that invaded my body had just become second nature to me at this point. I kept the bear dancing for about an hour longer, which was the amount of time it took for Shino to exhaust himself in his own excitement and start drifting off. Smiling fondly, Mother picked both of us up and carried us quietly to our rooms. I'd been moved to a toddler bed when I started recovering from my awful fevers, but Shino still used the crib, mostly because everyone was worried about him. It was a little awkward for me, having a baby brother while still also being a baby myself. If I'd been a bit more grown, I'd have been able to help take care of him, feed him, or otherwise take care of him. But despite my dwindling chakra metal dust and bugs, this body was still my biggest weakness. For now, I monitored him with my swarm, ready to signal someone else in my family if anything went wrong or take care of what I could. But it was still strange to me. As was my routine, I checked everyone's locations one last time, even as I settled into my tiny bed. Mother, already preparing the baby food for when Shino woke in an hour, hungry. Grandfather, in his chair, reading a book. Clan members, wandering throughout the compound. All heads accounted for. Closing my eyes, I let myself drift, falling somewhere between asleep and simply away. My power spread under the village. Shaped by my higanbana, it soaked into the ground like water and flowed beneath the surface like 1,000 tiny rivers. I'd long since identified the location of every underground hive in Konoha and made more than a few of my own, marking them in subtle ways to indicate the corresponding locations above ground. Like I had with the dust before, I could use that to reorient, guide, and connect my chakra to another nest, and another, until it touched upon all of them in a zigzagging network of lines. Then, with a thought, threads of power rose up along guiding trails, curling around pipes and drains, jumping between bugs nestled in walls, under and round and inside of buildings, until I found what I was looking for. It would be a lie to say my power covered Konoha. Truthfully, it covered less than 100% of Konoha, but with some effort and some prep, it could cover the right 100% of Konoha for my needs at any given time. And right now, that meant the parts surrounding our guests from Kumagakure. If someone noticed and asked, both of which I was trying to avoid, the truth was, I was invested, maybe even hopeful. Things were still tense enough in the ninja world that my father and most of the clan spent most of their time outside the village, because the Third Shinobi World War had reached the point where everyone pretty much agreed it was over, but less by unanimous agreement, and more by everyone just running out of lives to throw away. Iwa had been devastated badly enough that the conflict with them had come to an end, if begrudgingly. But things with Kire were apparently still tense after some kind of kidnapping hostage terrorist attack that people didn't talk about the details of much. And they hadn't so much apologized as they'd gotten enough of their strongest ninjas killed that the remainder had started killing each other to decide who was in charge. Right now, Konoha's best foreign relationship was Suna's careful indifference. But the fact Kumo had sent diplomats meant a lot. If Kumo and Konoha formally came to a peace agreement, none of the other villages should feel safe starting a fight alone, and Konoha would, hopefully, be able to wind down from its war footing. My father would be able to come home, and my brother wouldn't have to grow up with a backdrop of war, as long as nothing went wrong. So, I kept an eye on things. I wasn't alone in that. Even putting aside the Ambo the Hokage had assigned to the task, more than a few shinobi took strolls throughout the area, making sure everything was fine. The delegation had been given a hotel on Konoha's favorite tea street, and more than a few members of the military police had developed an interest in the beverage this week, because everyone wanted this mess to just be over. With so many different eyes on things, there shouldn't be any real risk, but I did my part regardless. And, at the same time, I was curious. It was my first real look at a ninja village outside of Konoha, my first chance to see how others did things. I knew from their reputation that Kuma was supposed to be the most technologically advanced among the ninja villages, and some even said they were now the most powerful as well. Apparently, their extensive experience with lightning chakra had given them a leg up both in making new technology and employing it in the field, powered by their ninja. That was, well, pretty damn cool, if I was being honest. And I wouldn't have hated it if I just happened to accidentally see them practicing. But, alas, I guess it was too much to hope for representatives from a ninja village to give anything away while in enemy territory, even when there didn't seem to be anyone watching. In point of fact, none of the members of the delegation had used their chakra much at all since their arrival. During the day, they'd have peace talks with one of Konoha's diplomats, or with the Hokage. But at night, they were quiet, never having anything more than meaningless small talk. They didn't discuss their goals, didn't talk about their village, didn't even go over their plans for the next day. They just chatted a bit, ate together, and went to sleep. That's ninjas for you, I suppose. Based on their actions during the day, they were clearly here to gather information on Konoha, though, which... was that normal for ambassadors? It felt like it was normal, and it was what I'd have done. Konoha acted like it was normal too, with planning sessions taking place elsewhere in the village, having shinobi deliberate about who they were allowed to interact with, what route their escorts would take, what they'd be shown and when and for how long. I even came up once, sort of. During the dark days of war, we all feared that things would never be the same again, the diplomat had said. But I am glad that I lived to see the day that we both proved ourselves wrong. With the burden of war gone, Kumo once more makes strides in more peaceful industries. I hear that Konoha has done the same. Words of your new textiles have spread far and wide. A sign that the lucky gods still smile upon us in these dark times. Konoha's representative answered with a smile, saying nothing else about the matter. I still wasn't sure if things were going well or not. I watched for a while longer. Dinner time came as Shino woke up hungry, and mother finished making the oyakodon. I still thought parent and child rice bowl was kind of a morbid way of describing chicken and eggs. But it tasted good, and Shino had taken to it after a somewhat worryingly slow start on solid foods. Shino had apparently enjoyed the bear show from earlier enough that he wanted a repeat performance, which apparently needed an encore, then a sequel, at which point it was thankfully time for bed again. I checked one last time to make sure everything was where it ought to be, and went to bed, hoping things would stay like this tomorrow as well. In my dreams, scattered scenes came together, slowly shifting into a nightmare. A man lay down on a table covered in something like plastic, holding still as someone cut open his chest with surgical precision. Carved into the bones of his ribcage were a crawling series of symbols. The man with the knife touched it, and something emerged, and the next moment, they started closing his wounds. They held their position for a while, one sitting near a window, waiting, and then with a word, they all vanished. Huh? Who? Flickering images crossed my mind as I caught glimpses of moving figures from odd, scattered angles, wandering into my lines of sight and out of them again. One of them seemed to be coming near. Near where? A door opened silently, and I saw a man recoil, as the only thing he found within were spiders. Huh? I thought blearily, opening my eyes. My first thought was, what's that noise? Then, fire? I thought, sensing heat and startling immediately to wakefulness. Almost on reflex, I sent out a command to all the swarms around me, those inside people's bodies startling their hosts awake. It was only a moment later that I realized the fire wasn't in my house but somewhere nearby it, inside and around a spiderweb castle. On the edge of wakefulness, through the eyes of my bugs, it seemed like it was right in front of me, but why would there be fire in a building made out of dirt and stone? I thought before my dream caught up with me. I felt someone fleeing the Aburame compound and I marked them, but I had a bad feeling about this. I reached out with my power, along the same lines I had earlier, and immediately noticed that things were wrong. There were a lot of people that weren't where I'd left them. The Hokage, most of the Anbu, and the diplomats from Kumo. I scattered my range, taking stock of my surroundings and then the village, looking for any signs that would help me make sense of what was going on. In the spiderweb castle, I had my spiders respond in an orderly manner, scurrying them out through back doors and little tunnels I prepared. At the same time, I focused, channeling my chakra into the earth. It was different from chakra-absorbing metal. That took in chakra on its own, held it for a while and could be made to expel it in different ways. Normal earth was less cooperative. But what was the point of training wheels if not to prepare for the real thing? Near the fire outside of the spiderweb castle, the ground slowly rose into a mount, just over ankle height, before rupturing, expelling a brief gout of dirt over the fire. It was minimally effective, but it was something. I started to do it again and again, pushing it to the back of my mind while I focused on other things. As long as it didn't spread out of control, that was good enough for now. With the wandering tendrils of my range, I found several people running through the village, most of them heading inwards, but one heading out. Not knowing the context, but able to recognize when something doesn't belong, I gathered enough bugs to make out the latter in detail. As soon as I got a good look, I recognized the head of Kumagakuri's delegation. But I didn't recognize the child he was carrying. Fuck. My heart sank for pretty much every reason. For a moment, 100 worst-case scenarios flashed through my mind before I exhaled sharply and focused. I rearranged my scattered range, calling the bugs I'd need and sending them that direction. At the same time, I looked for the Hokage. Not in his house, not in his office. Where was he? Very aware that I was wasting precious seconds, and that I had a finite amount of time before they vanished from my range. I reached out in a different direction. My grandfather had woken up immediately the first time I'd buzzed him and was already getting up, instantly alert. I buzzed him again, this time more mildly, before speaking through his swarm.
I have to impersonate you for a minute, grandfather.
I said.
It's urgent.
With my body, I slowly, carefully made 3 hand seals. Dog, boar, ram. Hench, I murmured, even as I rolled over and out of my taller bed. I had, of course, been spying on the Ninja Academy. I'd been curious to know what they taught to new shinobi, eager to learn how they guided people through the basics of chakra and jutsu, even while I practiced independently. I had a feeling that my family had requested that members of the clan be careful of what jutsu they used in the compound. But we lived in a ninja village. There was only so much that could be done on that front. Even without really trying, I picked up a few things, just because I'd had a few cousins practicing for their graduation exams. And once I already knew that, well, why not listen in on the rest? And when it came to the techniques taught to young shinobi, I thought all of them were amazing in their own ways. But the transformation technique might just be my favorite. Which was why its limitations made me so sad. See, the hench could change its user's size and mass, but a difference in either direction required a steadily growing amount of chakra. Not just an upfront cost, but a steady payment over time. Transforming into something with the same mass as yourself could be done more or less trivially, but going from 10 kilograms to 50 kilograms proved to be a bit taxing, as well as just kind of awkward. It might have been my lack of control, a limitation of the base technique, or both. But when most of your body was conjured, the quality of it got kind of iffy, especially as it got further from your main body. A surprising lack of leverage, random numbness, bouts of strange bendiness and other difficulties. It was like having full body prosthetics that were partially made out of balloons. After an embarrassing incident where my legs folded like accordions and I fell on my face while standing up, I decided to come back to the transformation technique after polishing my foundations a bit more. But needs must. I'd managed with most of my limbs gone before. I'd manage now. Calling the paltry remains of my chakra metal dust and wrapping it around myself, I used it as a stopgap to make a scaffolding, building a supporting structure out of chakra and iron like I had with the bear earlier, only much more spread out, and cast a hench over it. A moment later, I stood up, a carbon copy of my grandfather before the attack, and took a step. Less walking on stilts made of balloons, more just walking on stilts. I ruminated, but managed, taking hobbling steps out of the room and down the hall. The house phone was on the wall near the kitchen, which was thankfully close to Mai and Shino's rooms, and managed to take it off the rack without my arms bending, pushing a series of numbers I'd memorized and holding the phone to my ear. Shit, I thought when I heard only static. A moment later, my grandfather hastily hobbled down the hall, huffing slightly from the urgency my words had apparently instilled in him. I hung up the phone and cancelled the hench, because it wasn't helping me now. Phones are down, I said, reaching out, looking. It was late enough that most people weren't on their phones, but I found a couple of night owls that seemed to be confused too, as if their morning calls had just been cut. I found another person fiddling with their phone and figured that was enough of a pattern with what was going on. Across the entire village. What happened? Grandfather asked, continuing to huff and puff. Someone set the Spider Web castle on fire, I said, and Grandfather was in motion, scooping me up and checking the window before swearing. I marked the one who did it, but it might just be a distraction. The delegation from Kumo is gone, and I saw the head diplomat fleeing, carrying a child. Grandfather swore again. Mother appeared in the doorway a moment later, looking very tired and very sleepy. Mother cut herself off with a yawn, but took me when Grandfather passed me over to her. Not sure yet, but something's very wrong, Grandfather said. I'll secure the compound. Taura, contact the Hokage. He's not in his office or his house, I said. Check the basement of Kikyo Castle or the top room of the Intelligence Division. Those were used as situation rooms in the past, Grandfather said. In the case that all communications are suddenly cut off, standard procedure is to assume that an attack on the village is imminent, and to move high-ranking personnel from their known locations to a bunker while information is gathered. Those two had alternate comms. I shifted tracks, turning a portion of my power towards those locations. But along the way, I found several Ambu stopping and touching the sides of their heads before exchanging looks and moving in the same direction my power was going. In that moment, the pieces clicked. Grandfather, do you hear that buzzing? I asked before he could leave. Buzzing? He replied, frowning. He cocked his head, listening, before shaking his head. No, because it's my bugs that hear it, not my human ears, I thought. Something inaudible to human ears, but just barely within the hearing of my bugs, was ringing throughout much of the village. Hadn't I thought earlier about how Kumo was the most technologically advanced? How they'd learned how to combine their jutsu with technology? What if they'd figured out how to jam communications before anyone else? And if they did, and through subterfuge or interrogation had learned Konoha's standard operating procedures for such a cutoff, there was always a risk to being a step behind. In this case, if lines of communication went down and they hadn't received orders otherwise, procedure was to gather at probably 4 or 5 prepared locations throughout the village, with alternate lines of communication, with maybe several teams ensuring protection and escort of shinobi that could serve as backup lines of communication, like the Yamanaka clan, all in preparation of an imminent attack. But what if there was no attack? What if someone was trying to escape? As far as I could tell, that hadn't been a consideration, which, well, I had a feeling someone was probably going to get yelled at tomorrow, and new procedures would probably be written to make sure this never happened again. But sometimes things only needed to work once. And just by turning off the proverbial Wi-Fi, the head of Kumo's delegation had turned off half of the obstacles to him leaving the village, with most of the Ambu all but deliberately getting out of his way. I didn't bother conveying that realization to my grandfather, because time was of the essence. I kept reaching out with my power, eventually sacrificing my territory across a portion of the village to bubble the 2 buildings grandfather had named. There, I thought, sensing the Hokage through a literal fly on the wall. Credit where it's due, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, communications down for 2 to 5 minutes, and the Hokage already had his armor on and was giving orders. It took me a while to gather enough bugs. It took a lot to make a room bug-proof, but it was plenty possible to make a room a pain in the ass to get bugs into. The downside, perhaps, of living in a village with no bug manipulators. People were somewhat more conscious of bugs at times like this. Elsewhere, I could feel the target, the kidnapper, moving. The fastest flyers I'd sent from the compound just barely closing ground.
Hokage-sama,
I said through the paltry swarm I'd gathered. I couldn't make out micro-expressions, could barely make out features, and didn't have the time to do anything about it. But I saw the Hokage turn his head towards my bugs, at least. Shiru, he said deliberately. Report.
Kumo heads fleeing village, carrying child.
I replied tersely.
Lightning jutsu blocking communications. Bugs can hear. Set fire to Spider Castle.
The Hokage paused for a moment, but only for a moment. Damn it, he said. Direction? It took me a moment to work backwards and draw a mental map. I'd sensed him passing through Konoha T Avenue, heading northeast towards the upper edge of the village, but the delegates had been on T Avenue to begin with. If he was coming back through there, he must have come from the southwest side of the village. That would make sense with a member of the delegation entering the Aburame compound, but the man I marked wasn't heading in that direction. He was going west. At a guess?
Pass through T Avenue, heading northeast.
I said.
Child from southwest. Other members of delegation fleeing west.
Uchiha or Hyuga? The Hokage said immediately, almost too certain to be a guess, before turning away and saying something quickly to someone that I didn't catch. Where? Yamanaka and Nara. Other? Already, someone replied. Hiyashi? Fugaku? Not Rez. He isn't the list. I told you. The Hokage almost snarled before mastering himself with a deep breath. Get me Fugaku and 10 of his best men now. Hiruzen, if there is, attack. Another voice said, and Hokage turned towards it, but I was already drifting away. Unfortunately, I was beginning to understand. I reached out across town, first to the Uchiha, then to the Hyuga. Open to the air, it was easier to gather a swarm near both. I gathered one outside the bedroom of the Uchiha clan head. I think his name was...
Uchiha Fugaku,
I said through the buzzing of my swarm. Ninjas reacted fast. A kunai flew through my clone a moment later. I ignored it. Aburame, the man said, sounding like he was trying not to curse me out as one of his hands clutched his bedsheets. He took a deep breath. Is there a problem?
There's been a kidnapping, a betrayal by Kumo.
I conveyed.
An unknown child taken, suspected Uchiha or Hyuga. The Hokage will be sending for you and 10 of your best to track them. Kidnapper heading northwest.
Fugaku was already pulling on his clothes. His wife grabbed a rope and was out the door, moving to check on the 2 kids I'd sensed in the house, one of whom was already awake. On it, Fugaku said, wiping at his face roughly. A moment later, his eyes turned red, and I assumed he could handle the rest. I was keeping tabs on the kidnapper. The head ninja from Kumo was staying course, and before long he would reach the forests of Konoha's northeast. That could be both good and bad, depending on who was sent afterwards. It was, broadly speaking, Konoha's home court, but not every shinobi was specialized in tracking. For me, at least, it bought me some time, even given his head start. The swarm I'd put in motion was catching up quickly now, even as I gathered others in the woods. At the same time, another swarm gathered in the Hyuga compound, but the shinobi there were already wide awake. A crowd of men and women were already in motion, responding to something, veins pushing out around their eyes. I gathered my swarm into a clone near the crowd and immediately drew their attention. Who was the head of the Hyuga clan? I wondered. I didn't remember, but grandfather knew the head's father, the former head at least. The relationship there was... I wasn't sure. Mixed, at the very least. Maybe tense. But I don't think it was antagonistic so much as complicated. There was history there that I'd never asked about before, and I just hoped it wouldn't matter today.
Hideki,
I said through the swarm. Shiru, someone said brusquely. We're in a rush. What is it?
man passed through my territory, holding what I think is one of your kids.
Hinata, another man asked. Which direction?
Northeast, about 2 kilometers from the edge of Konoha, heading towards the forests, currently between a small pond and a river.
I said, pausing to gather details.
Just left a tree with a boulder near its roots, with something carved into the trunk.
I see him, the younger man said with a growl and made to move.
There's a problem.
I added.
It's Kumo's head ninja.
There was a pause throughout the compound. A trap, Hideki replied, scowl in his voice.
Maybe several traps,
I replied. I didn't have time for a full dialogue, so I made a map instead. A cut-off circle represented Konoha, pressed up against the Hokage rock. A dot with an arrow marked the head ninja, which I labeled as such, and showed it moving quickly towards the village's edge. Near the Aburame compound, I drew an X inside a box of fire. I drew a few other X's with question marks near some other disturbances I didn't have the time to look into yet. Over the top of the map, I wrote, "Communications shut down by unknown technique." I marked the Hyuga compound with a note that said Hyuga Hinata kidnapped, and wrote her name besides the head ninja. Then, I marked members of Kumo's delegation, starting with the one that lit the fires in the Spiderweb castle, but adding 2 more that I'd found in passing. That meant there were 2 more somewhere. Then, because it cost me nothing, I copied that map near the Hokage's location, and on a wall near Uchiha Fugaku and near my grandfather, although I didn't know what the latter would or could do about it. "Attack? Frame job? Something else?" Hideki asked quickly. "Father," the probably clan head said urgently.
All of the above?
I suggested. The elder of the Hyuga clan took a deep breath. "What do you propose?" Hideki asked, and the question took me somewhat off guard. What do I propose? I wasn't proposing anything. It had just been a statement. This was the issue with impersonating someone. I had no idea, truthfully, what the relationship between my grandfather and Hyuga Hideki was, and he was speaking like there was some kind of context to my words. But as my thoughts began to settle, the pieces started to come together. Both Hyuga Hideki and whomever had spoken there at the end near the Hokage had been worried that even if their communications had been disrupted as a trick to make them think an attack was coming, they couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that there might be an actual attack too, as a deeper trick. In that case, sending too many of their forces away from the village could put the village in even more danger. Especially because, since there had been a fire in the Spiderweb castle, there very well might be even more sabotage elsewhere, and they might not realize the extent of it until it was too late. Mulling it over, I couldn't dismiss that possibility, because I realized Kumo's logic in setting the castle ablaze. Kumo had no doubt acquired and tested some of Konoha's new silk by this point, and in the process, they'd probably realized that while it was somewhat resistant to electricity, it proved little to no defense against fire. Depending on how paranoid they were, they may have even thought that was an intentional part of the design, because it meant the armor was pretty damn good against the land of lightning, but would have a pretty gaping flaw if used against the land of fire. Given that, they decided that destroying or disrupting the source of production was more useful to them than obtaining it for themselves. That kind of sabotage could have been a prelude to a bigger attack. But the Hokage had wanted to know where the Hyuga, Uchiha, Nara, and Yamanaka were. Why? Because all of those clans, to one degree or another, had techniques that were suitable for capturing targets alive. Which made sense too, because it might be awkward if a foreign ambassador was found dead in Konoha. Except, looking at it another way, and taking those things together, wasn't this probably bad for us no matter what happened? On the surface, there were 3 issues at stake. 1. The risk of an attack, deepened by the threat of an unknown amount of sabotage. 2. The threat of Kumo stealing a member of one of Konoha's bloodlines. 3. The diplomatic incident that would result if Konoha killed Kumo's ambassadors. And already I think the Hokage had seen that, and was trying to thread that needle, to find a way through this without making any missteps or leaving room for criticism. He'd want to rescue the girl without killing the ambassador, while still showing that Konoha was strong enough to fend off an attack, because that was the right way out. But what does right have to do with this? I couldn't help but wonder, because I took that thought a step further. Because why wasn't Kumo worried about the diplomatic incident? Say the head ninja got away with a member of the Hyuga clan. Wouldn't Konoha obviously accuse Kumo of being responsible? Was Kumo so sure that they could get away with all of this without leaving even a trace behind? They couldn't be, because they'd already left traces so far, which meant Kumo had to be aware that they could get caught red-handed. And if Kumo did attack, wouldn't they obviously be the aggressor? Weren't they afraid of an international backlash? But why would they be? I wasn't an international leader or diplomat or anything, but something I've been taught the hard way, over and over and over again, is that bullies rarely care about your semantic achievements. Jack hadn't cared about how well people played by his supposed rules, any more than Emma had cared about the validity of my arguments against her insults. They don't care how impressively you managed to thread whatever needles, or how clever you were in finding a flaw in their argument. Because in the end, they aren't doing what they're doing because they have a moral or logical justification. They're doing it because they can, and you can't stop them, or else you would have already. It could be tempting, in an emergency, to try and understand the logic of your abusers, and figure out the rules and the right answer to the problem your enemies put you in. But sometimes, the only actual rule of the game is, you lose and they win. So, the better question really is, why do they think they can get away with this? And the answer was, they think that because they can. Because let's say there was a diplomatic incident, whether because the diplomats died or the girl was taken. Who would decide who was right and who was wrong? An international court of some kind? A decision made between the Kage? If it ever came down to that, Konoha would lose. Things like legality and evidence wouldn't even matter at that point. Konoha had buried most of Iwa's army and killed half of the 7 swordsmen of the mist during the war, so Iwa and Kiri's votes were all but guaranteed to be against us. Kumo was acting with the assurance that came with the understanding that if it ever came down to an international vote, to a debate of who was right and wrong in the eyes of the shinobi world, they would win pretty much no matter what. Because everyone hated Konoha right now. We'd be lucky if Suna just abstained rather than piling on. Would Kiri speak in Konoha's defense if one of its bloodlines were taken, while Kiri was actively butchering its own bloodlines, blaming them for the war? I wondered. Would Iwa show empathy for the bloodshed in Konoha if it came to a fight, after Konoha filled graveyards with Iwa Nin? It might look bad if Konoha killed a foreign diplomat, but then, if Kumo stole a child, would they give it back if it caused a fuss? Rather than there being 3 possible ways this could go wrong, couldn't it just go wrong in all 3 ways at once? If the sabotage successfully weakened Konoha, invade. If they successfully steal the child, even if they're exposed, gain a powerful bloodline and deny any wrongdoing. And if the mission fails, blame Konoha. Whoever had gone on this mission had no doubt been prepared to die from the beginning. On the surface, the way out of this situation might seem to be to handle it perfectly. But the game was rigged. If it came down to it, some of the diplomats might have ways to make sure they died. The real way out of this wasn't to play things perfectly. It was to make it clear that you weren't to be played with at all. Kumo was doing this, could do this, because they didn't have anything to fear. The only way to stop it would be to make them afraid. Because as is, the logic of his attack was painfully, brutally simple, in a way that cut through any considerations or brilliant planning. If you were strong, you would stop us, and if you don't, it's because you're weak. In the Aburame compound, I took a deep breath. I thought it through. I could try to play this game anyway. I had the power, though I'd need some directions on how to use it, on where to go and what to say to gather the right people, notify them of the problem, send them in the right direction, and hope everything worked out after they left my range. I could do it that way and keep my hands clean. Or I thought about the girl. Hyuga Hinata, the one that had been taken, the real danger and tragedy that lingered underneath a threat of war and diplomatic incidents. I thought about the fate that awaited her if she was taken, a spectrum of different shades of terrible. Would she spend her lifetime in captivity, used as breeding stock for a generation of Kumo Hyugas? Would she be indoctrinated, controlled with brainwashing, drugs, or genjutsu. They needed her bloodline, but would they need her specifically to have eyes when she grew up? Or would they just donate them to someone from Kumo? I thought about Dinah, of the fate that had befallen her, indirectly because of me. Then I thought of Shino, who was about that girl's age, and imagined if it had been him. I guess that settled it. It should have been a hard choice, difficult beyond the moral reasons, but it wasn't. If I just sent Kikaichu, it might have been. The clan's most common insects could drain someone's chakra so dry, they'd collapse and be left too weak to move for hours, if not days, or even die if their host didn't stop them. The problem was, that process wasn't exactly subtle, given the swarm it entailed, and it could be risky to use in a hostage situation. If I'd only considered the possibility then, it might have been too late. I'd improved the speed at which I could move my range around enormously with practice, but an adult shinobi would outrun it before too long unless I did something to stop them. Reaching out to people and having conversations had eaten up most of the time I had already. Except for the fact that, even without considering it, I'd snuck out some of the clan's other bugs just in case. If I was being generous to myself, I'd say that maybe a part of me had considered that it might come to this. If I wasn't... Coil told me once that I wasn't a killer, I thought. And I told him that he'd made me one and put a bullet in his brain. I died a killer too in the end, and I guess that means I've been born a killer this time too.
If he dies 30 minutes from now, far outside the village, with no trace of why, can you secure the girl without leaving any evidence behind?
I asked through my swarm. Elsewhere, I scrawled out my thoughts, quickly and haphazardly, on a desk in front of the Hokage. A pentagon with the names of each village at the corners, 3/5 of it filled. 3 possibilities I'd considered, written out briefly and struck through with a line of bugs. Then the 4th option, simply labeled Koshu. The Hokage closed his eyes, steepled his hands, and for a moment was silent and still. Hideki's response came far quicker. Yes, the Hyuga said, iron in his voice. 4 seconds later, the Hokage nodded ever so slightly. The bugs on his desk scattered.
Then it's done,
I said. It was that easy. It was almost terrifying, some of the bugs the Aburame clan had raised, and how easy they made ending lives. One in particular, the Koshu, was incredibly venomous, if relatively slow acting. More than poisonous enough to kill a man with a single bite, though they'd keep walking around like nothing happened for a little longer. And as soon as the body started to cool, the toxin would start breaking down without leaving a trace. In many ways, it was the culmination of the Aburame clan's many generations of assassination, killing with a touch from a frightening distance. 30 minutes, the head of the Hyuga clan murmured. Shukuba town? Hideki nodded, eyes already turning elsewhere. He pointed at 3 men in the crowd and gestured towards them. The team apparently decided, and the clan head took off. Hideki lingered for a while longer before murmuring something under his breath. Shiru, thank you, he said, and then he was gone as well. My view of the Kumonin dwindled as he got further and further away, my range and chakra stretching thinner and thinner until, minutes later, he left it entirely. Shortly after, the team of the Hyuga did the same. I waited then, every minute feeling like an hour. 27 minutes later, the jutsu cutting off communications abruptly vanished. 43 minutes after that, the Hyuga team came back into my range. They had the girl. I relaxed a touch. An Ambu approached, hand signs replacing communication before teams contacted one another. The Uchiha team that had been watching the remaining members of the Kumo delegation suddenly approached, sternly telling them they couldn't wander around like this, and escorted them back to their rooms without mentioning anything else. The delegation seemed to find that appropriately eerie. Come morning, the day started like nothing happened. By all accounts, it wasn't until Kona's representative came to meet them for the day that the village even realized that the head of said delegation was gone. At which point, confused communications trickled up the line. At 8:43 AM, the Hokage got on the phone to report to the Raikage that one of his men was missing. At a guess, it would probably be hours or days until the body was found, dead of no discernible cause, with no clear sign of why he was outside the village. I just had to hope that was enough. The fear that it conveyed. Just in case, I suspected no contact would be made between any of the parties involved on Konoha's side until a resolution was reached. In my house, my grandfather had long since finished securing the compound and put the fires out. Minimal damages since the spiders had escaped, and his series of jutsu made it like nothing had ever happened. Several members of the clan muttered quietly, suggesting, based on the lack of evidence of a jutsu, that the source might be a new variation of explosive tag, trading boom for an incendiary purpose. But grandfather hushed the speculation for now. When he came back inside, he took a seat on the couch, Buck surveilling the compound, and simply waiting. I joined him after a while. Eventually, Shino woke up, mother made food. The day went on, like it didn't remain to be seen whether the war was back on or not. Around 10 o'clock, my grandfather sighed, opening his eyes and rising. Taura and I will be spending the day together, grandfather told my mother, who frowned briefly before nodding. Grandfather laid his hand on my head before carefully picking me up. Best we do this now, while we still have a chance.